Hi, everyone. I'm Rejoice, and welcome to Umatta Consultant Podcast. If today's your first time on our show, please make sure you subscribe to all of our channels, especially Spotify. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Rena. She's a global people and cultural leader. I would love for her to introduce herself as she sees fit, and we'll dive right into the questions. So, Rena, the mic is yours, please.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be with you, Rejoice. Thrilled to be here today. And yeah, a little bit about myself. I've spent the last 25 years in a variety of different human resources roles. And I look back and I think of my career in three parts. So the first part I spent in New York City in corporate, working in high fashion publishing, in manufacturing, and at a global fintech firm. So lots of different industries. And then I finally got the courage to pursue my dream, which was working in the intersection of human rights and humanitarian aid. So I kind of quit spectacularly and made a list of my dream organizations. And I landed at a 100-year-old institution called the International Rescue Committee, founded by Albert Einstein. And I went in on a 3-month consultancy, and that turned into 13 years of I feel like I had 9 lives actually at IRC, lots of different roles. I headed up HR for the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. I headed up global HR strategy and had a really fulfilling career at the IRC. But as you can imagine, it was also quite intense. The organization works in high conflict settings and fragile states around the world, operating in war zones. I lived in Jordan and traveled extensively. I had a long distance relationship with my husband from Los Angeles to Amman. And so
Wow.
eventually that became quite a strain in our marriage, and I moved back to the United States and to Los Angeles. And I am now on a radical sabbatical, rejuvenating myself,
Hmm.
giving to the local community, spending breakfast with my son and time in his school. And it's been incredible. Also, been enjoying doing things like this, having interesting conversations with interesting people, upskilling in AI. And I said my career was 3 parts, and the third part is going to be written right now as we speak. So we'll see what that looks like, but I'm excited for the future.
For you. The rest is unwritten. And I feel like this conversation came at the right time, especially what we're in right now globally in terms of what's happening around us. With your experience, we'd love to pick your brain about your work you have done in all these fascinating places, and even learning more about your relationship, how you are able to maintain a long distance relationship with your career. Definitely we'll unpack all those things. But first, I want to start, Rena, by asking, you say people strategy is business strategy. Can you unpack what that really means in practice for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about that statement, people strategy is business strategy, I think about it in a couple different ways. The first is just being really pragmatic. Companies, whether it's private sector, whether it's nonprofit, are spending 30 to 70% of their revenue on their people. So the idea, right, there's so much with labor costs and benefits. So the idea that you would spend such a significant portion of your revenue and not be having your people strategy and business strategy intertwined, in a way, it would be lunacy, right? It's it wouldn't be a good investment of your resources if you didn't. But then there's the invisible ways
Mm,
that people and culture can either catapult your business forward and make it wildly successful, or can have the opposite, even disastrous effect. And I think about the axiom of the um, a lie will make it around the world before the truth has a chance to get their pants on. And I think of that similarly to not having a people and culture strategy, because if you don't write the narrative and if you don't chart the path for it, that vacuum will be created and it'll be filled by a narrative that, may not be good for your business. And so for me, these two things, a people strategy and business strategy, are fundamentally interconnected if you want to grow your business and meet the needs of your clients and customers.
Exactly. I love the point you made about the financials. If your money is invested in salary as a key indicator, why not make it a strategy? It's just business sense. But I know it sounds as easy as we're saying it, but in practice, it's sometimes it takes difficult conversations with executives to sort of help them understand why that's the case.
I think that's right, and, I think some of that, I have to say, is on the shoulders of us CHROs, where sometimes we are excited about new research that's come out or a new tech that we want to employ, and we get ahead of ourselves and are not ourselves in lockstep with the CEO, the C-suite, business strategy. So I think it's really important that as HR leaders, that we are also fundamentally understanding with a real level of depth the strategy, and that we, you know, bring and create people and culture solutions that actually make sense for that
Mm,
business.
great points. Now, going along with what you're saying, you've worked across 5 continents, and I love that you shared that in your introduction. What's one universal truth about people and culture that holds regardless of geographic area?
Yeah, well, for sure, we have to acknowledge there are tremendous differences, whether you're working in Afghanistan or New York City or London. So I acknowledge that. But one of the things that I've been stunned by is working in so many different countries and contexts, the universality that employees have, and I often think of it as fundamental as Maslow's hierarchy.
Mm,
So you first need you all human beings, and this falls true, I think, even as employees, we need a sense of safety and security. We need our workplaces to be safe. We need to have psychological safety. We want to be recognized. And I think that might look very different, whether when I was working in Myanmar and Thailand or Jordan and Lebanon, it might look differently. But at the end of the day, people do want to feel recognized and appreciated for the work. And we had actually, this really hit home for me with a very large people survey that we did, translated in 19 languages across over 40 countries. We got back over 9,000 comments at the IRC, and we poured through each and every single one of them because, as an HR leader, obviously the words expressed from our staff for their needs and their wants, it's gold. The thing that came through those 9,000 comments that was the single most consistent desire by staff was that they wanted their supervisor to sometimes say thank you for the work that they did. And that cut across Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas. And so that sense of recognition and then belonging, I have found it is consistent in every place that I have ever worked.
very true. Very true. I love that you tied into Milo's highest level of hierarchy, which we all love that recognition and belonging. It feels like even with home, right? Everyone wants to feel like they're part of the team or their home and so forth. Let's take it back to your work experience with the rescue committee. You supported 22,000 staff members globally. What does it take to build a cohesive culture at that scale with that number of people?
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that you've got, and we have, a series of microcultures when you've got 22,000 people and over 300 offices around the world. So I acknowledge that. But I think the the continuous strand that needs to happen in order that people do feel a sense of cohesion is that your mission is front and center
Mm,
in everything that you do, and especially true for nonprofits in the social impact space. Most people are working at a nonprofit, they're not in it for the money and the stock options, right? And so the mission needs to not only be front and center in rhetoric, but also in the micro behaviors that are telegraphed to the organization. So whether it's who's getting heard, who's getting listened to, who's getting shut down. I'll tell you, our CEO did something really small and really memorable many years ago. I observed it. We were in a large meeting, and actually, in every meeting I was in with him, I noticed this. He would be coming from CNN or an interview with the New York Times, and then into a probably less sexy, more boring meeting about, data or something. He never once looked at his phone, and I mean ever. That phone was shut off, upside down, or completely off the table. And in that, he telegraphed to everyone in that room and to the organization that people are important, that everyone's time is to be respected, and that this is a way to treat one another. And that really trickled down through the organization. So I think it's both front and center mission, but also thinking about the ways in which we behave day to day that really shapes a cohesive identity across borders, across cultures and time zones.
Yes, Rena, I'm very happy that you brought up the example with your CEO and his example that was demonstrated through a simple behavior, but it definitely was a large scale act that people witnessed and saw. Now, in terms of policy and procedure, so permit me to tackle this angle with that number of employees and different regions having different policies and procedures, even within the United States, right? Every state has its own regulatory needs. How, as a CHRO, how do you manage all those expectations? And also, how does your team ultimately fulfill their goals and requirements and emerge the culture so it does not necessarily diverge what the culture expects from them?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And you're right. The laws are vastly different from California to Mississippi from an employment law perspective, and that can really have an impact on the culture and on the expectations. I think with that, it's always leading with values first. So it's coming in and it's almost like a bit of a reverse engineering. You have your critical compliance mandates that you must meet, but the ways in which you meet those, having a values first perspective and bringing the values of the organization front and center with how you implement. So it might look like a new law or policy that's come into effect. And rather than top down, check the boxes, implementing that across the office or the organization, it's about bringing people in, helping them understand why we need to do this and co-creating with teams. How do we want this to look in our office, in our field office, with our team? I think that co-creation piece is absolutely huge.
Absolutely. Fantastic. I love that. I love collaborative success and working together with the team to make sure everyone understands what the mission is.
And I think, Joyce, people, we often say that and we hear it.
Right.
And sometimes it's like almost window dressing, like, okay, we're going to have one meeting, we're going to have an all staff or town hall, and we're going to hear what you have to say. But I really have enjoyed learning and pushing myself over the years to think more radically
Mm.
about inclusion, co creation, and also to go back to basics.
Mm.
So, um, I think one of the things I learned and through my career is I used to, I think sometimes over engineer and go for the very sophisticated programmatic strategy to address a problem. But actually it's the simplistic but radical ways that you can include people. So um, that might be something that I did in several of the roles I held, inviting a junior high potential staff member to take part in leadership board meetings, either to be an observer or a contributor to that. So like break down those silos on those walls of hierarchy. It might be as simple as, and this is going back, kind of old school. I used to walk the factory floor, and that is one of the best ways to be able to understand what employees are going through, what safety issues or environmental issues are at play. And I've tried to bring that into the office environment. So it could be something as simple but meaningful of setting up when you're a new role office hours that is on everybody's calendar. So you're not just saying, I have an open door policy, which a lot of leaders will say, but show me your open door policy, right? Like, so put it on the calendar, and I've done that in a couple of roles, and I've been astounded at how that small act of inviting people in and actually carving out and dedicating time over a period of months, the the response that I've gotten from veterans, from junior staff, who really appreciate that commitment. So I think there's sometimes smaller ways that we can make big change.
I agree with you. I agree with you. Sometimes it's not always the large scale events that corporates or corporations will put on, organizations will put on. It's what employees really want and need. It's sometimes the simple act of kindness that you just demonstrated definitely helps. Now, to tie it back to culture again, you've worked in everything from French tech to humanitarian organizations. How does cultural strategy differ differently from profit driven to mission driven organizations for those who are looking to sort of go into one or the other?
Yeah. So looking at the private sector and comparing it to the humanitarian or nonprofit space, I think there are both radical differences, but then there's also some really interesting things I've learned about the similarities between them. So, on the differences, there is, I would say, a lot less forgiveness
Mm,
from your staff population in a nonprofit that your organization, your people and culture strategy, that it is in lockstep with integrity, integrity tied to the mission and what the organization stands for. And in the private sector, I think there's a much greater emphasis on speed for decision making, and frankly, there's a greater emphasis as well on things like compensation. The thing that I have found though that's been really interesting and, you know, again, working in the Middle East, Asia, and around the world, I found this to be true. When I came into humanitarian aid, I think I had this notion that only saints work in this kind of work. And what I've really found is that when I was on Wall Street, they were incredibly kind people with a deep sense of humanity. And in the humanitarian world, equally and oppositely, there are sometimes people who lack integrity in those spaces. And what I've realized is that there's all sorts of humanity represented, and there isn't a singular way to define a particular people and culture strategy within nonprofit or in the private sector at a bank, for example. We're all more alike than we think. Yeah.
Wherever there's people, there's always a mixture of different personalities and behaviors, and whether ethical or non-ethical. And I think this is why also HR exists to mitigate risk and look at some of the challenges that comes with people strategy.
Completely.
What is the biggest mistake leaders make when trying to fix culture? So everyone talks about let's fix the culture. We need to fix our culture. Um, in your experience, Rena, what would you say is the biggest mistake leaders make when trying to fix their culture?
Yeah. Well, I think I'd probably even suggest that the idea that we can fix culture makes it feel like it's sort of a stagnant entity that can be just, transformed with a written strategy, for example.
Yeah.
And I think it does, again, go back to the authenticity of leaders and the ways in which they are behaving day in and day out. That will have a faster, more powerful trickle down and be able to change your culture. And if you want to fix it and, help transform it, then, you know, um, some wild investment into, some particular program. But I think the other thing that I think leaders sometimes overlook, and I find myself being guilty of it and constantly trying to learn this lesson, is when you're at the top of the house and, we're living in real dynamic times right now, right? the pace of change has never been greater. The pace of technological evolution has never been greater. And so we're constantly, our organizations are shifting. We're constantly doing reorgs. And what leaders sometimes do is we see those reorgs, we see it as like boxes and lines on a piece of, on a PowerPoint presentation, and we forget about the humanity and what it means to change one box to another, what it means for somebody to change a team, to change a boss, to change a location, to change the type of roles and responsibilities one has. And I think as leaders, remembering and putting yourself in the shoes of that staff. I have even often said to, C-suite leaders while we're trying to do a reorg, of which we did a dozen at one point at IRC in a very compressed time period. I said, imagine you're just talking about changing this person's role to this. I said, imagine tomorrow I told you we have a new CEO and you have a new boss tomorrow. And that really helped that particular person be able to see and experience, and at least vicariously, what that kind of change would be like for an employee. And so I think that's one thing that as leaders we could do better, is to up our empathy in very simple and accessible ways that will help shape not just the decisions we're making, but how we're implementing those decisions,
Mm.
how we're communicating those decisions, the kind of space and time we're giving to the change management process for somebody so that they can be successful and thrive in their new role.
Excellent. I like how you use transform words like transforming and also empathy and understanding that change doesn't come easily for none of us. It just takes time to dissect what's coming. And I like that. I feel as leaders, we have all at some point made the mistake of making hasty decisions and expecting people to just follow along and kept it going because it's their job, but not necessarily understanding that there is a human element in terms of accepting the change and then going along with the change. So I appreciate you. I know I have made that mistake in my career as well, in some areas where you're like, oh, this is a fantastic idea. Let's just do this. This is the timeline, but not realizing there's other people that you need their buy-in first before you start moving the needle. So I
100%. And, just to add to that, oftentimes you're talking about a change behind closed doors, and that could be for weeks or months, sometimes even years. But everybody else, unless they've been on that journey with you, it is like it's a radical, it could be radical for them. And so I completely agree with you with needing to bring people along. Yeah,
yes,
for
I
sure.
agree. Very much agree with you. I want to tie it into during periods of rapid change or crisis, as you highlighted from your work. I love that you've worked in Afghanistan, parts of Africa, and so forth. A lot of times when we think about crisis, people think about change. So, what are the non-negotiables for maintaining employee trust and engagement when you think about managing change and crisis?
That's a great question. I think really recognizing, I'll tell you something actually specific. So, in terms of being able to deliver people and culture work in the midst of crisis, whether it's at an organization like the one that I worked at, the IRC, where we were providing life saving services to people who were fleeing war and disaster, or whether you're part of a nonprofit working in an emergency room, or some kind of other services that have to do with life and death. I think it's very easy for these organizations to, and the people in them, for us to treat ourselves, those that are delivering that work and those services, as kind of a collateral
Mm,
damage. It's okay because people are facing life and death. And so employees, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how tired you are. It doesn't matter how long and hard you work. It doesn't matter the vicarious trauma. And so I think you asked about what's really important, non negotiable. And that is that we never forget to center the wellness of the very people who are delivering life-saving care to clients. Because if you don't, you've then lost your very pipeline to be able to deliver those services. It's really captured in a cliched saying of you've got to put your oxygen mask on, right? Or else you can't help that child next to you. That is absolutely fundamentally true in the workplace. And so that for me is something, that duty of care that we have as organizations, as leaders, and even to ourselves, the duty of care that we need to provide to ourselves. I think that's what's fundamental.
How you phrase it, duty of care, because that encompasses your team, your organization, and yourself. And particularly, I want to highlight yourself because if you're not taking care of yourself as a leader, how can you lead others? And I know we have seen even during COVID or different crises that were on TV where we had leaders pass out in
Yeah.
middle of a report because they're so tired. So I'm happy and excited that you are able to remind us that it is a duty to care for yourself, your organization, and also people that you lead. So then during crisis, you can respond as quickly as you can and solve those issues.
Absolutely, and it's a lesson that I will say I'm still working on, to this day. It's easy to get, especially when you're working in a mission-driven organization and you care so deeply and so profoundly, and are so moved by the work, it's easy to eradicate your own sense of self in giving to the mission, and it's almost a kind of martyrdom that can happen.
Yeah,
It's really important that we fight against it as individuals, but also collectively, as leaders as well.
excellent. I agree with you. And I like places that I have personally worked at where there is some sort of accountability partner to
Yeah,
remind you to take a day off, or you're looking like you need some tea today, or maybe you need a walk, or something just to remind you to take care of yourself. So,
100%.
so let's look at M&A integration, which often falls on people's side. What's the key to successful emerging of cultures, and what have you
Yeah.
your experience?
Yeah. So I got some really terrific and rapid experience in mergers and acquisitions early in my career. I worked at a Fortune 500 that was the result of dozens of mergers and acquisitions. And so I learned both what worked and what didn't. And I think one of the things that's really important is if if it's going to be a true merger, there's these platitudes that sometimes get thrown around, like, "We're gonna bring the best of both cultures together." And, yes, that's what you want to do, but you've gotta also acknowledge the often very divergent aspects
Mm,
of businesses or cultures coming together and stating them and putting them on the table. So in one particular acquisition that I worked on, one company was quite bureaucratic, slower moving, decisions were made much more by committee, and then the other was very decisive, very fast moving, very fast paced. And so by putting those acknowledged differences, you could already see, you could fast forward and see how those cultures were going to clash. And you could predict the more bureaucratic, slower moving cultures were going to feel perhaps ignored or sidelined at the speed that which decisions were made. And, a lot back and forth. So I think radical candor early, otherwise you'll have, resentment forever.
very true. Very true. And then that's when sometimes people call it maybe politics, but it could be culture, in terms of how things are done. So I can see that. But let's push it a little bit in from the another angle. How does, let's say, an emerger and one company maybe wants one culture to dominate the other?
Mm.
How, I don't know if you've run into this situation before. How does a CHRO help resolve that tension between the two cultures coming together, but at the same time, there's a specific culture that will prefer the rest of the people to follow along suit?
Yeah. Yeah, or you've got a bigger company, which I've seen in many cases, a bigger company gobbling up a smaller one, and so
Exactly.
naturally, right, maybe the systems of the dominant company are going to be the systems that the other company needs to take on, so I think that's very real, and at the risk of repeating myself, like, on the one hand, I think even to that question, it is about honesty and not sugarcoating. So, it's not pretending that it's an even playing field because
Exactly.
often it's not. And I think people smell dishonesty from,
Yeah.
a mile away. So I think that's one. But I think the second piece is there's a reason why that acquisition is happening. And so there is something valuable, and often it is, in fact, the intangible value of the employees and the talent within that organization. And so, how do we honor and respect that truth and that reality? And I think that comes with having, from a people and culture standpoint, it means actually not just lip service to integration, but actually bringing people from the less dominant company or culture, the one that maybe is being bought, into the room, into the conversations, and into the planning for what that integration work is going to look like, and giving them some real power and voice in how we set out the roadmap for change. I think that's really important because if you don't include people and then you just expect them to come on board, you're going to find that your ROI on that merger and acquisition is very quickly eroding. So it just makes business sense too.
Very true. And I love your answer on that, and especially when there is a business decision on why that emerged happened in the first place. So that has to be key in terms of steps moving forward, or maybe it's a technology issue, or maybe it's a leadership issue or training issue. It could be a number of angles why that occur, or sales, impacting
The-
sales and so forth. How do you balance performance and humanity? I know we were speaking a little bit earlier about purpose driven organizations and people who are driven towards these types of roles and
Mm.
responsibilities, especially when organizations are under pressure to deliver results, however they see results. How do you balance performance and humanity?
Yeah. You know, your question, and I think often when we talk about this, it it supposes that there's a tension between performance and humanity. And I think it's true that in some organizations it can look like that. But I actually think they're the same bet.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
I think that's because when you honor someone's humanity, you get the best from them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If I feel connected, seen, I have some autonomy to create, I have honest feedback about how I can be even better, and then I'm given tools to be able to be even better, that is gonna make my performance that much more stellar. So I would argue that the ways in which we think about these as sometimes diametric or opposed to each other, I think we need to, that's a false sort of dichotomy. And I think we need to bust it down and see that actually fueling humanity is the key to high performance cultures.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And I think there's a number of studies out there that tie these two together, to ultimately, if you want to get the best out of people, um, looking at people's performance and their belonging and humanity are all sort of one together. We have a question for you, and this sounds like a more of a personal reflection, Rena. In all of your global experiences, which they are awesome, by the way, was there a defining moment that completely changed how you think about leadership and people in general?
Hmm. I think earlier in the leadership roles I held, I thought that I had to have all the answers all the time. I had to have the perfect strategy. I had to, deliver the perfect program. And what I found that has been one of the more powerful lessons that have helped fuse sort of my 2.0 or 3.0 version of myself as a leader is showing vulnerability, soliciting feedback from my team, and I think that second one has a kind of exponential power that is almost kind of shocking. In the last role that I held, I asked my team of 20 to conduct an assessment, a 3-minute assessment of me against our core people leadership standards. And I took that on and then I actually published it across the team in an anonymized way so that people could see I was putting my areas of development right on the table,
Mm,
and I was addressing how I was gonna make changes in those particular spaces and ways, and I asked the team to help hold me accountable for it. And so that was it was both vulnerability, it was soliciting feedback, but it was also showing people that, hierarchy can sometimes stifle creativity, innovation, in its worst ways, you know, people have great ideas that never come to light, or people see a risk that never gets, funneled up because there's a fear to speak up, or, I can't jump over my boss's boss and so having a kind of an act that really shakes up the typical hierarchical paradigm is something that I've been playing with and really looking to explore further with like interesting ways to get people to feel comfortable to share with one another, with me, and then bring their whole and best selves to work.
amazing. I love that it sounds like vulnerability is one of your greatest assets or strengths. To be able to do that with that number of people, allow them to freely express themselves, and also you holding or asking them for their accountability feedback on yourself as a leader. It's extremely impactful and impressive. You don't get that many leaders saying they do ask their subordinates to sort of hold them accountable, right? It's always the opposite. So I like that you are open to why and what made you decide to do this.
Um, so we were talking the talk and I wanted to walk the walk on inclusion. I wanted to think about, often in life, I'm always pushing myself. Whenever I have a complaint or a frustration with someone or something, or some process or some strategy, I try to look inward. I had a professor that once said, the thing that irks you the most, that really irritates you, more than likely, it's because there's something about it that reminds you of you. And so I've taken that into my work. And so if I had been maybe frustrated at times at the lack of inclusion for particular people or processes or programs or strategies, I always thought to myself, well, okay, what can I do? Right? Like Gandhi, be the change you seek. And so that's really what had me do it. And I think the other thing is, I grew up um in a bit of an interesting background. I had a father that was born in Albania and who was Muslim, and a mother who was more than 20 years his junior, who was born in Poland and was Catholic. And yeah, so it was quite
Very
an
different
interesting
background.
dynamic. Yes. And so I had a lot of, not just difference, but real clashes kind of right inside my family environment, and early divorce and some socioeconomic disadvantage early on. And all of those formative experiences really had me or have me understand inclusion and the importance of it and the ways in which people can be sidelined very easily, and the way that people their experiences can be invisible. And so I've always just thought about what are ways to be able to like tease out and make the invisible visible, and what are ways that we can make sure that we're including people, and again in simple ways, through participation, their voice, their thoughts, and by expressly asking for it. And I think magic can happen when you do that.
Excellent. I agree with you 100%. And I love that your formative years expose you to societal, sometimes expectations or crashes of religion, culture, ethnicity, all these things that sort of sometimes give us a little bit of a friction between people and how people express themselves, where they stand. You saw that at a very early stage in your life, which ultimately you get to also experience at work because people bring all these things to work. And I like that you care about inclusion and you want to make sure everyone's voices are heard. So thank you for sharing that, Rena, with us. Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it actually, if I think about it, the conflicts that I experienced as a young girl, it created a desire in me to really want to be a bridge. And that's how I see if you're a people and culture leader and you're really effective in what you're doing, then you are a true bridge between the organization and people, and both the organization and the people in it see you as such. And I think that's, I didn't think about it until this conversation, but I think that's where why I was drawn to HR work. Yeah,
I agree with you 100%. Most HR people I've spoken to did not go into HR because they like the paperwork and they like the administrative parts. They typically have a core conviction of wanting to advocate for people. And
absolutely.
and that's why they're there. So we appreciate all HR leaders and super appreciative of the work you do for the organization and also for your employees. Rena, if any of our listeners would like to connect with you, I know you're on a sabbatical right now, but there is a next. We haven't talked about the next yet. I'm not sure if you want to give some insights of what that next could potentially look like. But if anyone wants to also connect with you, work with you, or maybe find more information about the work you have done in the past, how should they approach you? And what would you like to say about what is next for you?
Thank you so much, Rejoice, for that space. Yeah, I didn't mention at the top, but I'm doing a couple of very interesting consultancies. Some in the private sector, some in the nonprofit, some international, some local. And I have been really enjoying getting to see the insides of different types of organizations and my next step, I think, at the end of as the sabbatical's winding down, I would really love to contribute and make an impact in a senior HR leadership role in the social impact space, ideally in California, where I've now made my home. And you can find me on LinkedIn at Rena Kokalari and would really, welcome the conversation as I deepen my Los Angeles and California network and community, and look forward to to my next chapter.
Thank you so much. And we're here for it. We wish you the best for your next chapter. We're sure it's going to be amazing. Next chapter for you, and we're going to be watching out for what you're going to be doing and here to support if you need us. But once again, thank you so much for being part of our show, for sharing your remarkable experience and your nuggets with us. And I personally have learned so much from a lot of the key points that you have shared with us. And for our listeners, please make sure you subscribe on Spotify if you have not and follow us on LinkedIn. We'll love to speak with you guys next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Rejoice. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate you.
Thanks.